Hello, this is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And today I have some good news I think I haven't shared on this channel anyways yet, which is that the Old School Companion 1 is now a gold bestseller on Drivethru RPG, joining such games as Arrows of Indra and the platinum best-selling Lion and Dragon. The Old School Companion 2 is, at the moment, I think a silver bestseller, so it's making its way. And you guys should check it out, Medieval Authentic Adventures. It's my latest big book. All right, so that's the good news. And now on to the topic of the day. This is coming out of a discussion that I had with someone on Twitter, but it's actually a long time issue with me that I think it's really unusual to me how people get this sort of thing wrong, right? Like, I mean, okay, I can understand. It's one thing if you like or dislike Dungeons and Dragons, right? If you like or dislike certain mechanics in it. But the success of it makes it obvious that pretending that it's bad, pretending like, I don't mean bad like evil in this case, I mean bad like mechanically bad, is stupid. And if you think that a certain mechanic is bad and you think you have a list of reasons, what you have to do is turn around and look at what it is. You know, ask yourself, why is it then that this mechanic is so successful, even though it seems dumb to you, right? And the case in point is hit points, all right? Because once again, that old question had come up on Twitter. I believe it was based on a thread started by Taylor Lane. Taylor Lane has a habit of making interesting threads that sometimes have a lot of interesting people commenting on details of game design. And the topic was, well, you know, that hit points don't really mean anything, and they are a silly way to manage health or combat or life or whatever in Dungeons and Dragons. That's what the argument was in short. You know, the point was, and let's looking at it as best as I can from this perspective, is that the argument that the other side is making here is that hit points don't actually reflect your physical health. They don't reflect anything specific. They're a completely abstract concept, and they aren't all that exciting because, for example, in combat, if you've got a character with 100 hit points and a character with 1 out of 100 left, they don't have any mechanical differences or penalties to their actions, right? Like theoretically, that sounds like somebody who's really, really wounded, right? But they're not actually having penalties to do things. Now, of course, there's reasons for that, but I'll get to that in a moment. And basically that nobody knows what hit points are meant to really represent. Even, I believe, somebody quoted Gary Gygax saying, well, they don't really mean anything, right? They're just hit points. And that's actually part of the genius of hit points as a mechanic, all right? Because in a hit point system, you're right, you're not tracking your general health, right? You're not tracking. Some people say, well, it represents a combination of health and exhaustion. I think that was the argument they tried to make in second edition when they needed to explain what the hell are hit points. They're like, it's a combination of your physical resistance, your stamina, your combat skill at avoiding damage, and your level of tiredness, right? So like, so in theory, out of, if you have some really high level character with 100 hit points, some percentage of those 100 are just their actual, life points, like their physical resistance. Some of them represent how exhausted they are, or how exhausted they can be before it starts affecting them. Some of it is like their agility and dodging skills, but that doesn't sound right. Like hit points implies somebody hits you and suddenly you're more damaged than you were before, right? That's what it sounds like to me, anyways. But it's also clearly not a wounding system, because if it was, then the lower down you are, the closer to death you are, the more you should be suffering some kind of effect, right? So D&D does not have a wounding system per se. It has hit points, but it doesn't have a system where, you end up suffering physical long-term consequences from your injuries, with tiny little exceptions like stuff like, there are some magic weapons, for example, that can cut you and then you start bleeding at a rate of 1 hit point per round or something like that. And then, so that's clearly, you're injured, you're bleeding. The bleeding, though, is causing you to lose hit points. So what's that about, right? When you think about it, it doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, but I'm going to explain. You shouldn't look at hit points as a mechanic that reflects something in world, right? Any more than, say, level does, right? Or saving throw bonuses, right? People don't go around knowing what their saving throw bonuses are, right? in the world. Hit points are an abstract concept that is meant to serve the player. They're not a reflection on the character exactly. They're an amalgam of a variety of factors, mainly related to experience, right? But also things like constitution and whatever, that reflect a level of risk. The thing that hit points measures is risk. Now, I know that sounds a little odd, but it's true. When you're looking at your hit points, you're looking at a way to assess how much risk there is in a battle as it's going on. So, if you've got 100 hit points and you take 99 points of damage, you're at 1 hit point. That hasn't affected your health at all. So it's not a measure of your health, but it is a measure of your risk, right? Because now I only have 1 hit point left. If anything hits me, I'm dropping, right? So it is a measurement of risk, not of health. And the part that the critics of the kind of hit point mechanics don't understand, because they think, well, it's not realistic, it's not interesting. You're right, it's not realistic and it's not particularly interesting, but it is incredibly usable. It is usable and playable in a way that no other system has actually managed to achieve. And that's why it's been copied over and over again, right? If you use a system with complex levels of woundedness and exhaustion, it is harder to keep track of, and it creates the risk of the problem of the death spiral, where your character gets gimpier and gimpier the more damage he takes, and therefore is less likely to survive the battle. That's a very... that's in a way very realistic. It might be sensible in a in what is meant to be a very gritty sort of emulation of realism setting. That might be a sensible thing to have, even though I don't think it's the best way to do that. I'm going to explain what's the best way to do that in a moment. But what it actually, what those systems do most of the times is dishearten the players, right? And it's also not like a system of exhaustion. It's not like wound levels or any of those things. But it's much easier than any of those things. That's the secret to its success. It is easy because what you're assessing is risk. You're assessing, and it tells you something much more valuable, really, than anything else. Because with any other system of damage, you have to then calculate from that the risk. With hit points, the hit points mark the level of risk itself. And this is why it's been reproduced over and over again, right? Other games, sometimes they'll call them wound points or whatever, vitality points, but those are still hit points, and we all know that. But it's not just in other RPGs. It's become the measure of the whole concept. It's become a central concept in game design at the video game level, right? Not just in D&D based type games like NetHack or the Forgotten Realms computer games or something like that. But in all kinds of other games, including, not obviously RPGs, but including also, like combat games, where anywhere that you have a health bar, that's hit points. That's the health bar, right? And so you watch your health bar as you're playing, and you see it's going down, and that is assessing the level of risk that you're under, and so how many more punches you can take before you're dropped, right? It is something of incredible practical value to the player, which is why it's so successful as a mechanic. And there's no other mechanic that has ever done that quite so successfully. So arguing that hit points are dumb is wrong. Hit points are not dumb. Hit points are simple, but that's why they're so good. That's why they're so successful. Now, you can argue hit points are boring, and that's kind of true. And it's especially true in an environment where there's other mechanics that have been set up in such a way on purpose or by accident that make it difficult for there to be real danger beyond the static risk level of the standard D&D hit points. And let me see if I can elaborate on that a bit. So you have hit points in a D&D system, and the hit points are a measurement, and they're a fairly reliable measurement. So like if you know more or less what your opponent can hit you for, how much points of damage, and you know that's consistent. So you're fighting an orc, and that orc does a d8 plus 1 anytime they hit you, and you've got 30 hit points left, and you know your armor class, and you don't know exactly how well the orc hits, but you've got an idea, then you can immediately make kind of an assessment of the level of risk you're under and in that circumstance, right? Whether it's high or low or medium. In general, sometimes the odds can be beaten, but it's you also know that if you've got 30 hit points and the orc does 1d8 plus 1 points of damage, there is not any way, based on those conditions, that the orc could kill you in one blow. Literally, right? It's impossible, even though the orc is like this dude with the spiked mace or whatever, and he's going to try to bash you in the fucking head with it. You can't die from that. And so that's one of the great criticisms that they point out of hit points in the D&D mechanic, is that it is in some cases anti-emulative, because in a novel or in the real world or in the way that the fantasy world of the game setting should work, if you're a human being, regardless of how experienced a combatant you are, and an enemy grabs a big knife, right? Let's say a d6 damage knife. You as a human being should be worried, because nobody, no matter how good you are, is able to assume that one lucky strike from that knife isn't going to kill them. Now, it's different if you're doing an emulation of something very cinematic, because in the cinematic thing you can have, the guy who's like, medieval James Bond, and he knows he's not going to be killed by some third-rate loser, right, with a knife. But it still creates this suspension of disbelief, because the player themselves know that there is no way in the world, barring something like, the knife being poisoned or something like that, but otherwise there's no way, that not by damage alone, that knife is going to kill them in one stab. And that changes how you're handling things, right? It changes how you're playing. And what it means is that if you have then a combatant that is, let's say, a very high level warrior, he's got 100 hit points, and he's fighting a group of a half dozen Kentish peasants. He knows he's going to win that fight. There's no way, there's no chance, unless the Kentish peasants come up with something else that does not involve just purely trying to deal damage points, or they somehow have something, they've got a cannon hidden in the bushes, and they're going to hit him dead on with a cannonball, right? But if all they've got is clubs and spears, and this dude is armed and armored, and he's got the hit points, and they each have between 1 and 6 hit points each, and he's got 100, he's going to win that fight. There's no chance, no possibility whatsoever in a standard D&D game. So that is a legitimate argument. Now, in some cases, and for some people, that doesn't matter, right? The kind of high fantasy cinematic style that is typical of D&D worlds, that shouldn't really matter, because there shouldn't be any way that a group of Kentish peasants should be able to, I don't know what they're doing in the Forgotten Realms anyways. They came from Kent and ended up in Farron, but let's say that they're there. There's no way that they should be able to fight to stop a 20th level paladin, that has 100 hit points or whatever. So that's all right. But for other genres, it's not really all right, and it's something that needs to be addressed. And so there are ways to go about fixing that. You can use things like mechanics for wounding or for levels of exhaustion. And, one of the ways is that kind of cumulative damage effect, that if you take X amount of hit points, then suddenly you're now at a penalty, and then when you get more hit point damage, you're at a higher penalty. But that creates the risk of the death spiral, right? That if you're now less competent because you've gotten an injury, and you're going to become more incompetent the more injury you take, then it quickly turns into a situation where your character is potentially doomed to die, right? Or everything but. So that's not good either. And I think that the best way to resolve this sort of situation, because again, hit points are not really a measure of wounds, they're a measure of risk, is that if you want to apply elements of wounding, then you need some kind of a critical hit system. Like, for example, the one I have in Lion and Dragon. In Lion and Dragon, if a character does an attack roll, they get a natural 20, then they roll on a critical table. Now, this critical table is very weighted to favor fighting classes and to favor player characters, so to say, because as a rule, characters will tend to not. I mean, the characters will tend to not be likely to get a devastating injury from a single critical blow, but it can happen, right? And it can especially happen if you're fighting against somebody who has a lot of martial training. So then that that and you keep that in mind. But it's also set up so that they can make impressive attacks on the enemy. But it's the main reason that I included criticals in Lion and Dragon. And the system is very simple. You get a natural 20, you roll on this table. The tables, there are different tables, and in the old school Companion 1, you have a whole list of critical tables that are used for, different kinds of attacks there. There's piercing, slashing. There's only one table in the main Lion and Dragon group: blunt, arrows, pointed range weapons, slings, stones, and bullets, and animal and monster attacks, as well as some critical hits from other types of damage. Anyway, so if a character's hit, there's a roll on that table where, all but the highest effects are not immediately lethal. Even the very highest effect is not automatically lethal, right? You get as high as possible an effect, is where a player character will have to do a saving throw to avoid instant death. If they succeed, they still take triple damage, right? So there's a risk, but it's not a guarantee. That Kentish peasant might get a natural 20 on the attack roll, and then they might get a natural 20 on the effect of their critical, and then the character will have to do a saving throw. If he fails the saving throw, he's dead. If he succeeds, he's taking 3d6 points of damage, because that's triple the damage, right? So, but what it creates is a scenario that I wanted, that is necessary for a medieval authentic game, which is one that every warrior, and there are going to be some warriors that are going to be incredibly more effective and incredibly more powerful than a typical man, right? Than the typical Kentish peasant soldier, right? I don't know why I'm on the Kents here, but there you go. The Kentish peasant man, he is going to be vastly inferior to a mid-level, to say nothing of a high-level trained warrior, whether it's a mercenary or a knight. And so they're going to look totally badass. And it creates that kind of style of situation that you see in Game of Thrones, where you have a number of badass warrior characters that in the series are incredibly tough. But you also know in the series that any one of them might die at any time. First and foremost, because George R.R. Martin is kind of a bastard, but second, because that's the world, because it's a world where, the injuries can happen to the greatest of warriors. And that was the medieval world too. There were all kinds of incredibly badass warriors that were taken out in stupid ways, right? The most famous example being Richard the Lionheart, maybe the greatest warrior of Christendom in his own lifetime. Incredible, just absolutely dedicated soldier. He was on the throne for 10 years. He spent 9.5 of those years fighting in wars, and he loved it. And, he'd slaughtered 50 men at a time in battles, right? He'd gone charging into, there's that joke from Blackadder of charging into the hordes of the Turks armed with nothing but a blunt spoon, that's the sort of thing that Richard I did, okay? And yet, he gets killed by a lucky shot from a 14-year-old peasant boy from a very high altitude with a crossbow bolt. Right, that's what takes him out. Just a complete fluke by a nobody, by what is obviously a 0-level character. So, that's what you have to be able to reflect, right? And then that's not the only time it happened. The Earl of Warwick's father, who was a very well-respected and renowned warrior in his time during the War of the Roses, was taken down by, you guessed it, Kentish peasantmen. So that's how this goes, right? And so that possibility, what it does, first of all, it provides also a bunch of minor injuries, which can be balanced out with, the hit point damage, and reflecting actual wounding rather than just level of risk. But it also creates the risk of, at any moment, even though you look at that hit point track, where you are with that, a really unlucky hit can also immediately bring you down to 0, right? And then that allows for a type of genre where you want every combat to involve a sense of danger. There's never any moment where a high-level character can look at it and go, oh, this is nothing. I'm just walking through this like it was nothing, right? And that's an important detail for certain types of campaigns. Anyway, so that is my explanation of why hit points are actually not stupid. They're actually enormously clever. And what you need to do, as always, is adapt that system or add to that system, modulate that system based on the type of genre you want to have. So that's everything. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and share this video anywhere you think people will find it interesting or where it might piss people off. And if you want to support me, you can check out all of my products, including the 2 Old School Companions. Volume 1 is full of sourcebook material, stuff that you can use to add to any of your OSR campaigns, or D&D campaigns, to make it more medieval authentic. Lots and lots of different mechanics and tables and info of all different kinds. Also, lots of real medieval magic in there. And then the Old School Companion 2 is a collection of 26, I think it is, medieval authentic adventures. So all various different kinds based on medieval folklore, legend, and history. Or my other books like Arrows of Indra and Lion and Dragon. And also, if you don't have a lot of cash, check out the RPG Pundit Presents PDF series. The link is in the description below. And, you can pick up an RPG Pundit Presents PDF, and it'll only cost you a couple of bucks. There's 106 different ones, so you're going to find some topic there that'll interest you. And it'll only cost you a couple of bucks, so it's like you're buying me a coffee, but you're also getting something for yourself. You can support me if you like on Patreon, but, I would much rather that you get something out of your supporting me that you can actually use in role-playing. Unless you're not a role player and you want to support me anyways, well then get on to Patreon. Thank you very much. I guess that's everything. And currently smoking Stanwell Deluxe plus Argento Natural.